Welcome, YouTube and Twitch. If you're new here, this was recorded on my live stream. You can more than welcome to join us on the live stream, twitch.tv/AmericAccounts. That's where I live stream. And today we're going to talk about a topic called Docker versus Kubernetes. If you're new to both of these things, I want to lay the groundwork of what the differences are between the two. And, you know, there's a lot of similarities on some of the things that they do. And actually, Kubernetes can, in theory, leverage parts of Docker. So let's jump into it. So we're going to first talk about what Docker is. So we're all familiar with our computer. This is a piece of hardware. You know, from now on, I'm going to be talking about these as a node. That's how I generally refer to them. Whether it's a VM or a bare metal machine, I don't know, and I don't really care. Obviously, there are some reasons you might care, but for this conversation, it doesn't matter. So we have a computer, and on this, we have some sort of operating system. Now, our operating system can be broken down into two levels, especially here on Linux. We have the kernel, and then we have the user space. And this is being a little bit simplistic, but that's fine. User space. Okay. So, in the traditional sense, a VM is the full stack with both user space, user space, and kernel space. And this is on virtual hardware, a virtual node. So virtualized hardware, virtualized memory, virtualized disk, virtualized everything. This is the classic VM. I'm not going to draw. My drawing's garbage. This is your classic VM. So what's Docker? And if you're using something like KVM, this doesn't actually have to sit in user space. This VM, a lot of the times these VMs sit straight on the kernel. Happy days. KVM, shout out. Great project. Okay, so that's your classic VM. What's Docker? Well, Docker is this thing that allows you to isolate a process. Now, this process doesn't run in any of this stuff. So a lot of times you say, like, you have an application that runs in a VM. Well, Docker doesn't do this. Docker will sit here. And, you know, I have Docker on my computer. So let's get rid of this. We can do Docker PS, and you can see Docker is running, and it can list these things that are running on my computer. Cool. But Docker itself doesn't run this. So a lot of the times you think of some VM thing that's running this. You know, I'm going to put this back up here, and we're going to put KVM. So KVM is running this, or it could be Hyper-V in Windows. There is something that is running this, and this thing is important. It's the thing that's making the virtual memory, the virtual networks, the virtual everything. And so VMs run on these hypervisors. They run on a hypervisor. So a lot of times people think what Docker does is Docker runs your isolated process. Now, a lot of the times people get this wrong, and they say that this is Docker and that this isolated process runs on Docker. And this is the first thing that's just not true. Docker runs here, yes, but this isolated process runs straight on your kernel. It runs straight on. It has no access to your user space, your user space. Let's make this a little wider. It only has access to the user space that you package inside of it. And Docker here it's not running in Docker. It's not running on Docker. It's not running around Docker. All Docker does, or the Docker command line. Now, if we're talking about Docker Desktop provides a lot of stuff, and we're not getting into that. But all Docker, the command line does, is it provides you a command line utility to create this isolated process running on whatever kernel that you have. This isolated process does not have its own kernel. It doesn't have any of that type of stuff. It is merely a packaged user space set to run your process. This is what Docker is. I'm going to pause for just a second to see if anybody has any questions about where we are. And I know that we're explaining a lot because I want people to understand the difference between Kubernetes and Docker. I've had this question multiple times, and so it has to be something people are wondering about. And so I'm going to try to answer it as thoroughly as possible. All right, so this is what Docker does. It's an isolated process. And when I mean isolated process, I mean literally an isolated Linux process. That's what it is. It doesn't have any, you'll notice there's no virtual node here. There's no kernel. These two things are specifically missing from this. It's using this kernel and it's using this hardware. This is why it's also not as strongly, as not a strong isolation as a VM is. Okay? Now, this is what a container is. This isolated process. A better name for it, one that we've talked about, is container. That's what a lot of people refer to it as. This is your container. Or sometimes they'll call it your Docker image. This could be your Docker image. It could be a container image. Those are all the same names for the same thing. Let's actually list them all out here. Docker image. These are all referring to the same thing. And we're not talking about Docker Swarm. Not talking about Docker Swarm because that would be a versus. Docker Swarm and Kubernetes are a versus. Nobad and Kubernetes are a versus. Absolutely. But let's move on. Okay, so these are what a lot of people, when they refer to Docker, they're referring to these containers. Now, Docker on my machine, again, is just a command line utility that helps me create these on my machine. Create, manage, pull new images. It has a lot of functionality that helps you do this. Now, let's talk about what Kubernetes is. Now, we're talking about a single node here. Kubernetes, by design, and I'm just going to talk about, I'm going to do this as node now to make it a little bit easier. Kubernetes, by design, let's space these a little bit more appropriately. There we go. Is not caring about a single node. What it wants to do is it wants to orchestrate processes across nodes. So I'm going to put Kubernetes up here. Now, Kubernetes actually runs on these nodes itself, but we're just going to imagine that Kubernetes is running not on these nodes because, in fact, it can. Kubernetes itself can run on another subset of nodes, and the nodes that actually do the work, and this is actually best practice, are a different group of nodes. All right, so we don't care where it's running, and we don't care that it's actually several things. Kubernetes isn't a single thing. Kubernetes, its job is to run isolated processes. I'm going to just shorthand that to container here, and manage these across multiple nodes. Thank you so much for the follow. Thank you so much. And manage these across the nodes. Now, what does Kubernetes leverage to do this? Well, by default, it leverages containers. It leverages a project called Containerd. Containerd. Now, if everybody's like, oh, it uses Containerd, it doesn't use Docker, they would be a misinformed. I was going to say something a little harsher, but they'll be misinformed. We'll just go with misinformed. Trying to be a little nicer. They'd be misinformed. Containerd is a project made by Docker. And Docker actually leverages Containerd. Docker is really the CLI, and it actually uses Containerd to make these things. When you install Docker, you install Containerd, and it does these things. So by default, Kubernetes uses Containerd on the nodes. We'll make this one node a little bit fatter. To make it has to be a real wide one. There we go. To make containers that's running on the kernel. Again, if we were visualizing it like we made the big node over here, we would have a kernel. We would have a kernel here. This container sitting right there, and it's leveraging Containerd. Now, Kubernetes actually leverages Containerd directly to run these containers. It doesn't have the Docker CLI because it's not a CLI tool that you really want to use. To be fair, you don't really want to use this. You can use Containerd directly, and it's not nearly as fun as Docker. Docker provides a lot of nice wrappers around things. Okay, so this is kind of like a zoomed in view of Kubernetes management on a single node here. So you can kind of think of Kubernetes as leveraging Docker. It's only leveraging a part of Docker. It's not leveraging the Docker CLI. It doesn't care about a CLI because this is a CLI, or Docker Desktop on your Windows or Mac is also doing some VM stuff to pipe your stuff to Linux because, again, all of this is a Linux construct. There are Windows containers. We're not talking about Windows containers. And so this is Kubernetes. Kubernetes is orchestrating and these isolated processes across nodes. Does this make sense? And does this make sense why Dutch joined in and said it's not really a versus? It's not. Kubernetes leverages containers, leverages Docker. It used to leverage the Docker CLI because there wasn't this OCI format, this specification. But now there's this specification that Containerd implements. And Docker is really just the CLI that uses Containerd. Sure, this is not the full architecture. Just to be clear, there is, actually Kubernetes doesn't call Containerd. What happens is, like, Kubernetes, if you wanted to get into it, there's a Kubernetes client. This Kubernetes client is called kubectl, not kubectl. The kubelet, and the kubelet calls the container. I wasn't breaking down the whole architecture, but the kubelet calls Containerd. Containerd makes the container. The kubelet does other stuff too. It manages the networking for the node as well. Again, that's getting a little bit more into the architecture of that. My point was more to share of Kubernetes versus Docker at a high level, because people ask. You're not the first person to ask. I've been asked several times. Kubernetes versus Docker kind of looks like this. It's not a versus. It's a yes, Kubernetes and Docker. Now, can you configure the kubelet to not use Containerd? Yes, you can. You absolutely can. So you can actually have a Kubernetes cluster that doesn't use Containerd. You can have a Kubernetes cluster that doesn't use containers. You can actually use VMs if you want. You do this because this is the Containerd, like I said, I say recent, it's been like 2 or 3 years, has the OCI specification, the API. And this container API or pod interface can actually be intercepted by something that's not creating pods and can create VMs for you. So it can be done. And if people want to do that, we can spend a Saturday and do that. We can make a Kubernetes cluster that does VMs. Absolutely. Those are all like well beyond the conversation at hand. The conversation at hand was Kubernetes versus Docker. And the answer is like, it's just not an answer. It's not a question. That's probably the better thing. The more you understand that Docker can be leveraged, or Containerd, which again is part of, was created. I know it was gifted to the CNCF, but it was created by Docker, and it's the default engine Docker uses to create containers. So yeah, and Containerd is the default for Kubernetes. You use kubeadm to install Kubernetes. You use Containerd. And yeah, there's a lot of stuff the kubelet can do, a lot of things that you can change, but that's well beyond this conversation. If you're watching me on YouTube, want to see more of this live, twitch.tv/MerrickCounts. If you guys are on Twitch already, let's continue on.